Hello and welcome to Semaphore Uncut, a podcast for developers about building great products. Today I'm excited to welcome Peter Cooper. Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Great. Yeah, please just go ahead and introduce yourself.
So I'm Peter Cooper. If you might know me from different email newsletters like JavaScript Weekly, Ruby Weekly, Go Weekly, just put something and then put weekly on the end of it. And, there's kind of a 50% chance that I'm involved with it as somewhere down the line. My background is been in publishing for quite some time. I can go into a bit more detail about that as we go along. But literally in the 90s, I was running fanzines about programming and stuff on Usenet. So I was quite early on with doing this type of thing, but moved into blogging. And then from blogging, I went into chairing conferences. I went into writing a book about Ruby called Beginning Ruby. And I also created a blog to promote that book called Ruby Inside, which between, I think, about 2005 and 2010 was like the biggest Ruby and Rails kind of related blog, other than the official ones, of course. And then that kind of folded over into email when I began Ruby Weekly in 2010. And from there, I've kind of used the whole Mark Zuckerberg-esque domino kind of approach of Facebook grew from school to school to school. I've kind of grown this business from topic to topic to topic as our kind of audience overlaps each other between Ruby and JavaScript and databases and all the different various things that we cover. And then we reach today, where I run a company. There's 5 of us. We have some external curators, and we have about 10 different weekly publications going out to around 500,000 people each week. So yeah, it's been exciting. It's been a slow and steady kind of growth, and I've got to see a lot of stuff that's happened in the industry over that time, which I'm sure we're going to discuss over the next half hour or so.
Yeah, great. Just before starting the recording, I asked when was the first Ruby Weekly published. You said 2010, and yeah, I think that I was actually subscribed from the very, very early days since we started in the Ruby community. And yeah, in terms of running Ruby Weekly, it's almost 600 or more weeklies that went out. Am I correct?
Yeah, just hundreds and hundreds.
Yeah. So can you maybe speak a bit about, how it went, what changed, and yeah.
So, as I mentioned, I was running the Ruby Inside blog, and people were more interested in the news I was sharing and the interesting projects that I surfaced and things like that. And that kind of idea is just carried on. But I discovered that of around the 2009, 2010 area, that was when there were companies like Groupon and Living Social, companies like that were kind of growing up, and they were using email as their notification platform of choice. And that was actually kind of a novel thing at the time. Most companies would, have a website and they'd traffic to the website and sell whatever it was, whether it was a SaaS product or physical products like Amazon or whatever. But actually using email as the core driver of business was a novel thing. And there were a lot of people at the time, and, I've been on Hacker News since it began, and lots of people were chatting about, is email kind of like the next big thing? Like, it was considered to be old-fashioned and old school. It was just something used at work to intercommunicate in those pre-Slack kind of times. And yeah, I just saw it and I was like, yeah, this is a perfect way of communicating with people, because Google Reader was kind of dying at the time. So RSS was having a bit of a crisis, which I think it still is, to be fair, in some ways. And I just saw email as this great way of being able to reach people that might want to learn about things, but didn't want to have to keep checking a blog every day, or, maybe have been just got out of RSS because, they gave up Google Reader and just didn't like anything else. So I started the email, and I mentioned it on Ruby Inside, where I think I had about 40,000 RSS subscribers at the time. And within a few days, I had like a couple of thousand subscribers. So you can't do that nowadays. It's a little bit more difficult. Because I had this audience already, I kind of transitioned them into email. And over time, the blog kind of faded away and the email grew. And the original plan wasn't actually to have it be a business in its own right, because the blog was doing fine. Like, I had ads down the side, and people like Jeffrey Grossenbach of Peep Code, he used to pay a certain amount of money to have his logo in the corner and stuff, and that worked great. I just wanted to create an email to actually promote some Ruby courses that I was doing at the time. It worked really well. Sort of have 30 people, they're paying a few $100s each, and that's a nice monthly income if you do that once or twice a month. But I just kind of ended up finding that actually teaching is very, very hard work. Lots of respect to people that can do that all the time. And I was more interested in doing the news side of it and sharing the stories and all that type of side of it. So when people began to reach out, and I can't remember how early on Semaphore was with this, but when companies like Semaphore and others reached out and said, oh, can we be mentioned in this? It then rapidly became kind of a business of its own right.
I would say that we were happy to pay back then as we are now. And as a bootstrap company with, limited budgets, I think that Ruby really helped us get the word out and bootstrap our business.
We've had a few like that, actually. One of our first sponsors was a company, and I can't remember what they're called now, but they were like selling one of the first Rails template apps. So like a boilerplate app. And it wasn't a very common thing back then. And, we put it in just one listing. They paid us, and they didn't even pay us like a lot. Like, it was really cheap. And they had like over 1,000 clicks, and they sold a whole ton of these templates. And they were like, really happy. But oddly, they didn't come back for some reason. I can't remember what the whole story was with that. But they had so much success in this one thing that they went on to do other stuff. So yeah, we've had a few stories like that.
Hey everyone, Semaphore has published an open source book called CI/CD with Docker and Kubernetes. It combines just the right amount of best practices and practical advice for shipping cloud native apps. Download your free copy today at semaphoreCI.com. There was a publication called PC Press and Linux Journal and those things that you buy and read. I like that distraction-free environment of reading. And then for me personally, your designs were always clean and kind of distraction-free. And when I receive that newsletter, I can, focus, and it has a limited number of topics. It's not overwhelming. So for me, that was the transition that really happened. You mentioned Hacker News, and there are many other areas, and I don't engage in discussions that much and comments and so on. So this was like the perfect medium for me.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, part of my job is to engage in discussions and see what's going on and use that to kind of influence and inspire and kind of give me ideas as to what's happening kind of on the ground. But I try and like distill a lot of what I learn and find out about the world and then distill that into the issues. So, most of the items that we include have a summary or, something along those lines written with them that help provide a little bit of context as to why something is important or why you should check out a certain project. Sometimes the title just sells it, it's like amazing thing release and everyone knows exactly what that means. But if it's more subtle, then sometimes I need to explain, why is this relevant and interesting? And I do that by, you know, doing some of the activities that perhaps some developers consider to be not a productive use of their time, like engaging in arguments on Twitter or Hacker News or whatever, because I'm trying to get to like the nub of why are people interested in this thing. And so if I can do that and save people the time in my explanations, then, that's a win-win.
Absolutely. And now that I think about it, that's one of the huge values, because if you're short on time and you skim through it and you read those descriptions, you can get a glimpse of what's going on even without diving in each of those articles. Yeah. You are definitely a long-time Ruby user and teacher, as you also said. So over time, you witnessed a lot of hypes, technologies, changes in technologies, and also some maybe culture shifts over these years. So what are maybe some milestones that you would point out?
Well, it's also culture cycles as well. I think the older I get and the longer that I've done it, like the more you can kind of see these loops occurring sometimes. So just to pick one example, like databases, how everyone was pushing relational databases. It was the way to do things. There were a few key value things back in the day, like Barclay DB and things, but people were really pushing, MySQL and then SQL Server and all that type of stuff. And then all the NoSQL stuff came along, and we had MongoDB and all those types of things came along, and everyone was pushing that, and everyone was like, "Oh, let's move on to Node and let's do this and let's do MongoDB. We don't have to worry about our schemas anymore," and blah blah blah. And then now you're suddenly seeing Postgres exploding again, and everyone's trying to use the Postgres wire protocol for their own kind of databases that they're building, or they're building time series databases on top of Postgres, like Timescale are doing. And you just get to see these funny cycles of like, oh, we're suddenly all back onto Postgres again now. Now it's the cool thing. And you see this with everything. You see it, with how everyone pushed onto REST, and then everyone's like, oh no, let's move on to GraphQL for our APIs. And then, it's all going to come back again, and just round and round and round. And I think actually, that kind of correlates a lot to things that happen in real life. In real life, we have these cycles of, having very, progressive moments in our society, and then they become more conservative and then veer back to being progressive again. So cycles in communities is kind of a normal thing. And I guess just the older I get, the less I'm focusing perhaps so much on the short term immediate changes and more on the how is something we're doing now, how does that relate to some academic paper that someone wrote in the 70s, like, because there are things like that you can look at today. People look at some of the things that are happening in like the Elixir and Erlang worlds and things like that and going, oh yeah, someone wrote a paper about this like in 1984, and you know this has now come true. So I'm very interested kind of as a cross between industry analyst but also, I don't know, like
Anthropologist.
yeah, almost anthropology. I was going to say historian, but actually that's not accurate because my knowledge that I keep in my head is actually quite small. I just know what to look for. But yeah, more of as like a code for apologist. That's just a terrible word, but I'm coining it today. But to see these kind of loops and cycles and what matters and what doesn't matter, and obviously a lot of what gets discussed nowadays, a lot of things just don't matter, but it's just part of the chatter. So yeah, I've seen a lot of things come and go. But as we mentioned before, Ruby is an interesting example of some of these things of loops and changes and that, because Ruby came out in the 90s and was basically limited almost entirely to Japan for the first sort of 10 years of its life. I think Dave Thomas picked it up in 2001 or so, and then he was really, really early. He was one of your previous episodes, actually, yeah, that I listened to. But he was really early on to Ruby in the Western world, and we sort of owe a debt to him for helping show us all like the benefits of that. But then, of course, came along Rails, which then just opened it up even more. And, that's when I kind of came in 2004. And there were kind of all these people just like hanging around, just being like, wow, this is amazing. We can build stuff with this. And, there were people like Toby Look at it. He, built Shopify, which I always confuse with Spotify for some reason. I've made this mistake in issues before and it causes problems. So he began Shopify, and they still run, on a Ruby and Rails stack, and they're doing all sorts of clever stuff with it. And they're tens of $billion worth company. Ruby kind of grew like really, really quickly in those early days between 2004 to 2010, but then it kind of entered a lull. And I noticed this actually when I was building the newsletter, sort of around 2015, 2016. It was a real dead zone for Ruby. Like people were just giving it up, and people saying, "Oh no, Node is the next big thing," or we're going to move on to Elixir one of these days, and blah blah blah. But then over time, it's gradually kind of come back again, and like Ruby actually now, even though there's perhaps not such a large glut of people being excited to learn it in the way that they're learning Python. Beginners aren't necessarily coming straight to Ruby now, but in terms of the industry use of it, it's higher than ever before. It's in heavy use all over the place, but it's become a mature technology. And I remember back in 2004 when DHH did some talks about Ruby and Rails, and he had these slides about like sticking his fingers up to Java and stuff like that. Oh, Java sucks and blah, blah, blah. But at the time, Java was like the number one language. Like it was heavily, heavily used. And now it almost feels like we're coming back to a similar kind of cycle where new languages come out or new ecosystems come out. Node is probably a poor example because it's been out some time now. It's been like 10 years. But there are things coming out now where they're looking at Ruby and Rails and going, oh, it's kind of old fashioned, blah, blah, blah. We're better. We can do it quicker. We've got type checking. It makes our, code better to run and blah, blah, blah. And they kind of stick their fingers up at Ruby and Rails in a way, despite, kind of owing a debt to them. So it's just funny to see that happen. And Ruby is now, it's not as big as Java was even in 2004, but it kind of has this entrenched position where there's so many people using it, even if it's not the talk of the town anymore. And I love seeing things like that.
Yeah, these cycles that you mentioned are very interesting. I wonder if it's also related maybe to the number of people who are in the, developer workforce. So I read somewhere that at any point, like 50% of all developers developing today have less than 5 years of experience. So yeah, I just don't know if that number could be also related.
It could be, because I mean, obviously, one thing that I've noticed that is actually kind of relevant to what your line of business is that while trends in languages and how are we going to store data and things like that, they kind of go in cycles, as I've mentioned. In terms of the underlying infrastructure and tooling, that's where we actually seem to see these kind of jolts and shifts and this constant progression. we don't seem to see cycles quite so much in how things get deployed. So, if you look back at, even like 20 years ago with like some PHP or something, you just upload it to a website and bam, it works. Or, you spin up a VPS like 10 years ago and you just, you set it all up and you upload your software and blah, blah, blah. And nowadays, everyone's using Git, possibly, to a certain extent. A lot of people are using containers. I mean, even they're starting to look old hat in certain situations now. Everyone's using, like CI/CD, especially like in commercial development. That wasn't a thing like 20 years ago, really, like as a mainstream thing. And so there's all these different things that have now been added on, like the cloud and managed databases and so on and so forth. And that underlying thing has changed and improved. And I think a lot of the newer developers, when they come into the market and they're immediately taught, like, right, here's how to use Docker, here's how to create a container. This separates all of your stuff from your other things. Like, you can use Docker on your desktop, it keeps your database separate from set of a developer environment in it. It's running Linux and whatever, but you're on the Mac. And you've kind of got all these things going on that they're taught now from square one. Whereas going in and setting up a server from scratch and downloading packages and doing it all manually is kind of an alien concept now. You can use Terraform, you can use Ansible, you can use whatever, you can deploy things. It doesn't even matter now as a server. There's serverless stuff. You can just deploy functions straight up to that. So yeah, it almost feels like the infrastructure and the underpinnings of what we do progresses and evolves and changes, but it's the kind of the bits on top, the languages, and how do we actually build these apps? That's the bit that kind of seems to cycle. But there is, progression in the tooling and the trends underneath.
Hey, I'm going to take a quick break here and tell you that Semaphore has a new book out called CI/CD with Docker and Kubernetes. If you are looking to deploy cloud-native apps, it's going to show you the most productive way of doing that. And the best of all, it's free. Download your free copy today at semaphoreCI.com. I mean, what you explained about the infrastructure could be maybe summed up under the name of like raising the level of abstraction.
Yeah.
I talked with quite a few people actually over time on this podcast here about that and about how approachable it is for newcomers, because you definitely purchased VPS at some point in your life and got some, Ubuntu or whatever distribution on it. And then you went in and, from setting up SH keys, installing MySQL and so on, did everything on your own.
Yeah.
For the people now entering the industry, someone would call them crazy, if they're a developer and they are doing that. So as abstraction is shifting, there are actually more things to know about. There are details that you don't have to worry about anymore, which are somewhere below. But yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, I began programming in the 80s as a kid, and back then coding was a completely different ball game. You had your home computer and you'd literally start typing 10, print, blah, 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 20, go to 10, run. Well, actually, to be fair, I was doing some 6502 assembly programming in the 80s as well. So you were kind of operating at a reasonably low level there with the machines that you had. And it was always fun to kind of dig into their corners and see, what happens if I push this, sort of byte into this part of memory, and what's going on in this piece of memory. And you could kind of keep the whole thing in your head. You could like keep an 80s kind of, home computer, like all the different pieces and different chips in there. You could keep them in your head and be like, oh, I can experiment, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, as you say, the level of abstraction has completely changed, whereas you might have written some sort of little stock control program on an 80s computer and written it in a few hundred lines of code and know now every piece of it worked. Now you're building the same thing, but on the web. So like you're building it over a network. Like I remember when networks were considered like to be very, very edgy and new, especially in a home environment.
It was extremely hard.
Yeah. I mean, we had a 10 base 2 network in my house in like late 90s, with coax cable running everywhere. It was an absolute nightmare. But that kind of idea of connecting machines together in the home was really, really new. We were a geeky family and into this kind of stuff. I mean, it's only actually probably in the last 10 years that the average mainstream home has got Wi-Fi and everyone's kind of connected to each other. Everyone understands implicitly what it means to be connected to the internet and how all these things connected together. But once upon a time, it was so alien and so new. And looking at things from an 80s perspective, this idea of building apps that run entirely over a network, to me, from an 80s point of view, is very, very alien. But then, as I've mentioned, there are cycles. There were client server systems, especially in the mainframe world, back then and that did operate over kind of networks of sorts. And again, these things go in cycles. So yeah, I do love thinking about how things have changed, but how things come back, with like serverless is probably a great example of that, where so many things go out the window when it comes to serverless. It's almost like, oh yeah, upload some code and bam, it works. And that's another another game changer. And we're only going to see more of that as time goes by. I'm not very good at the futuristic stuff, the futurism, and predicting what's going to happen, but we'll look back on this in another 20 years and be like, oh yeah, this is just like another loop of an extension of something we did, in 2020.
Yeah, one concrete example that I was pretty surprised with, one of these meshes in the Kubernetes world now that are important building block. There is one called Glue, and what they are building is actually based on WebAssembly.
Yeah.
So technology that was developed for the purpose of running things faster in browser moved now deep into the networking stack of Kubernetes, which is very infrastructure level stuff, and things are being compiled into that and are running there. It's also in that area of like creativity, what you take from which area of industry and applies to some, completely, almost bizarre place.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think people should keep that in mind, actually, especially if anyone's listening to this and they are kind of relatively new to the industry and they kind of, look at all these people doing things and think, oh, they're all big experts and, I don't know exactly what I'm doing and I have to learn and blah, blah, blah. Actually, a lot of the things that we end up taking on as massive shifts in how we develop software come from the weirdest places. Like they come from people that are not experienced at all in developing software, like in the long term. Even just to pick on DHH with Rails, like he's been quite clear about what his development experience was. He'd only been developing like a few years before coming up with Rails. He wasn't super steeped in the developer world or the developer history, like from what I understand from listening to him and stuff. And he still came up with that. And as you've mentioned, WebAssembly coming into the server side and things like that. If you just take a few steps back, like a few years, and you think about what led to that point, it's just absolutely hilarious because, WebAssembly kind of almost spawned out of the ASM.js project. It's kind of like an ancestor of it, I guess, which was this idea of creating this subset of JavaScript that could be compiled and run in a very efficient way upon the bytecode engines in the browsers. So you could do cool stuff like, run a 3D game in the browser and, it would be fast and so on. And then this kind of stemmed from JavaScript, which, if you go back to the 90s, was an extremely slow stain on the web almost. Like it allowed you to make a few forms interesting. It allowed you to mess around with your cursor, and JavaScript was just rubbish early on. I mean, there's not any other way to put it. It had a few different tasks it could do, but no one was thinking like, oh, it could run the planet. It's going to be used as the underpinnings or the lead to a system that is going to run high performance software over a network. Like that just was not on the radar. That's why I like looking back in history and thinking from an older perspective. If you've got an idea now, it might not be so extreme or as far fetched as you think, because so many things that we do now come from far fetched ideas from people that don't necessarily have a lot of experience and that have figured out how to join a few things together, and you end up with stuff like Rails. So, yeah, take that as some inspiration. Like, if you got an idea that you think, well, hang on, I can join these two things together and it kind of has this cool result, then just like do it and just put it out there and throw it out there and let everyone chew it to bits and see where it goes, because that's how we progress in this space.
And when you put that component and, where are you in your career? For instance, if we take you and me, we are very busy with our current businesses. And, even if we were not running business with some technology stack, we would be doing something. And we would not be making those accidental discoveries because we will be very busy. People who are early on in their career have much more freedom in that area because they don't have something, which is dragging them along into the next decade.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah. We saw that also with the guys that built Mono, for example. Was that Miguel Dicaza and Nat Friedman, who is now the CEO of GitHub. I used to follow Nat Friedman's blog from like about 2001 through to about 2007. And yeah, he was a normal guy. He was just working with Miguel. They were working on Mono. They were working on Linux desktop projects, which at the time weren't even particularly popular. But kind of led to things, like they built upon each other and led to things that are now very, very significant. They both built things that were significant in the underpinning of what we do now, but the things at the time weren't necessarily super duper popular, and they kind of had this impact nonetheless. And, ending up as a CEO of GitHub is not a bad place to be. But yeah, once you get to a certain age, and I think it's actually probably might be slightly ageist to say that, older people don't come up with necessarily the next big idea. I'm sure it does happen, but it's not the main thing that occurs. It does tend to be people that are more experimental earlier in their careers and take these risks, or just doing something at the weekend and messing around, and they revolutionize a scene. Actually, kind of sadly, in last week, we've had some news that one of the leading developers of Super Nintendo emulation, and actually had a massive impact on the world of emulation generally, unfortunately died in the last week. And this person, lots of stories have come out about them, and they only got into development because they wanted to translate a Japanese game into English, and they couldn't figure out how to render the English fonts within the Super Nintendo ROM that they'd downloaded into an emulator. And from that one inspiration of doing that one slightly geeky, weird thing, they ended up spending all this time learning about how emulators worked. And then they built an emulator, and they built the best Super Nintendo emulator. And then all the things they've learned and shared online have fed into other emulators. And now, emulation is a massive thing. Like Nintendo actually ship emulators of their own software on these like mini consoles that they send out now, and when they emulate stuff on the Switch and things like that. So it's just weird, like where inspiration comes from and where shifts come from. And it can be from as simple as wanting a English translation of your Japanese game can make you a significant force. As you say, as you get older, those things tend to die away, because when you've got a slightly weird passion that you want to really, really chase, it's different when you're older. And I've noticed it in myself, actually, that your brain does, to a certain extent, slow down. And it's not always a bad thing, because it allows you to kind of take stock and approach problems in different ways. But if it's about, I've got this ridiculous idea, I'm literally going to stay up for 48 hours and finish it off in one go and then see what happens, that doesn't happen anymore. Like, you've got families, you've got age, staying up, 48 hours will just melt my brain. So yeah, it's unfortunate, but as you mature, things change. It's just how life goes.
Something you mentioned that you had an interesting experience and you might want to talk about is that you work with some people organizing conferences and being a member of those boards and committees there. Do you want to maybe talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so this isn't a world that perhaps a lot of developers really know much about, because it's quite a privilege and it's quite unusual to be invited to chair a conference, unless you put together your own conference for like a user group or something like that, which, is now increasingly more common to do. But yeah, so because I was running JavaScript Weekly, I got the attention of someone called Simon St. Laurent, who was working at O'Reilly Media. So they're the ones that publish all the books with the animals on the front. People kind of create joke covers of nowadays. And I think nowadays, actually, they're probably less known for their books and more for running Safari, which is like this online training thing for developers. But at the time, they were focusing on the books and focusing on conferences. So their conference division is like 40, 50 people at the time. And it was huge, lots of people. And they would put on things like OSCON, Strata, and there were a whole bunch of other different events. And OSCON, was quite significant, particularly in growing the Perl world. So, before I was a Rubyist, I was a Perl developer. And so things like OSCON were pretty significant to me back then. I was doing JavaScript Weekly, and I think they kind of figured out that, okay, this guy probably knows a bunch of people in the JavaScript space. B, he's got a big audience. And so C, that makes sense to kind of bring him on, be a chair of a conference. He can, invite all the people that he knows. He can promote the conference to his audience, and hey, we all make a lot of money. And that's kind of what happened. Like, they were launching a new conference called Fluent, which ran between 2012 and about 2017. So we ran about 5 times. And being a chair of a conference is very interesting, especially when you're not financially on the line for the conference. So O'Reilly would, they would do all the logistics. They'd sort out people's travel expenses, and they'd sort out the venue and all that type of stuff. I didn't have to worry about anything other than the programming of the conference. And being a chair of a conference is a lot like running a newsletter. And that might sound a little bit weird to some people, but it's this idea of knowing what a big picture is within a space, or being able to try and figure out what the big picture is, and connecting to people that are doing cool things, shining the spotlight on them, and putting together a program of things, putting together a schedule almost is like putting together a newsletter. It's like, right, we'll have a talk about this here, talk about this here, talk about this here, and this kind of connects together, and these people, connect together in various ways. And yeah, it was just a very interesting experience to do that. And I did an OSCON Europe as well. Eventually, I came too busy with a newsletter site to kind of give it up, and O'Reilly began scaling down their operations and things. But I did learn, a lot about events during that time. And while there are a lot of pointless things about events, I have a funny story for you. I was speaking to some of the people that run these events, and ticket sales are always very, very important, especially for a company like O'Reilly, where, it was all about, they had to make money because they had to employ 40 or 50 people to run the events. And that's not cheap, as I'm sure you can imagine. And I was always like, why do people buy tickets like on the day? Or why do people buy tickets, months in advance? And then why are there people that buy tickets and then they check in, but then they're not at the event? Or maybe they don't even check in at the event. They just buy a ticket and they never turn up. They're like, oh yeah, this is like a nice side of the business. It's only a very, very tiny piece. Like, most people turn up and, they attend the conference like anyone else would. But there's actually a group of people that would buy a ticket or get their employees to buy a ticket. They would come along to the city where the event was. So, let's say it's Las Vegas, for example. They would check in at the event, would get their badge or whatever, and immediately leave and never come back to the event. And I was like, well, why is that? And they're like, well, it's a free holiday. Like, they've basically said to their employer, yeah, I'm going to go to this event like in Las Vegas for a week. Give me the flight and the board and everything, buy the ticket. They would go there, check in, get the ticket, and then go and gamble for a week. And apparently this went on. So yeah, I just found that kind of an amusing part of human nature, I guess. But yeah, I don't want to ramble on too much about the experience, but I would say, if you do get to ever be involved with the organization of an event and you're not super involved in the financial commitments of it, because I know people that have started events and they've been huge financial sinks and huge burdens on them, and that's really not a good place to be, like, where you're worried about your income because you haven't sold enough tickets. If you can kind of step back about that at all, and you help out with the organization and getting the speakers and stuff, it's a fantastic way to meet people and a fantastic way to learn more about what people are working on in a way that merely attending the event doesn't give you. Because as the chair of an event, you get more access to people, and people just want to talk to you more and stuff like that. So yeah, if you do get a chance to organize, just do it. It's like the difference between reading a newsletter and running your own. Like, there's so many people now that run their own newsletter or run their own YouTube channel, run their own podcast like this one. I'm actually speaking to you as like the host of this show. Like, you get more from this than just if you were listening to hundreds of podcasts every single day, because there's this kind of extra dimension. You get to speak to the guests and so on. And I guess this kind of all just ties into a big thesis of mine that developers in general should try to be involved in content creation at some level or another, whether it's through an event or a podcast or a YouTube channel or blogging, or just hanging out on Hacker News and Twitter and wherever, because it just gives you this kind of exposure to things and allows you to kind of find your place in the world.
Well, it is great, and it can be inspirational, I think, for a lot of people who might be even early in their career. You don't have to be absolute expert on the topic, to start, teaching other people on that topic. It's not that you have to have, 10 years of experience of writing, let's say, Node.js app, that you can start teaching people about the first steps.
Yeah. I think a key thing to do is just disclose what your level of experience is, and or who your target audience is. So like Dan Abramov of the React project is really good at this. Like, he does these great blog posts about advanced kind of React JS topics, but he'll write in the top, he'll say, right, this is a really advanced topic and it's kind of interesting to people who really geek out about React, but if you're learning React, this is not relevant to you. You don't need to read this. And I love it when he does that, because otherwise, it's like, oh, Dan Abramov wrote something, I must read it. Like, well, no, you don't have to read it. Like, he's actually saying, this is interesting for geeky React people. This doesn't have to be every single person who uses React has to know this. And so if you can write stuff, even if you're inexperienced, even if you write and say, look, I'm learning X topic. Now, Julia Evans actually is a perfect example of someone who nails this. She does amazing blog posts where she's like, I'm learning how to use a debugger. Oh, I've learned this about a debugger. The debugger does this. If you type this, this happens. I've learned this connects to this. if you're not used to it, it almost seems like a very naive kind of way of writing, but actually it's incredibly clever because she is very upfront about saying, I am learning this thing. You're coming along for the ride with me. Here's what I learned. And actually, this is very, very useful experience. And she's not going in saying, I'm a super duper expert at debuggers and you should listen to me and this is how it works. She's actually saying, I'm learning this, come along with me. And if you can put that into your blogs or YouTube or whatever, you will build up more of an audience, but also feel less of a fraud than if you just go in and say, you've learned how to use a tool for like 10 minutes and you're like, right, I can write a blog post about this. Here's how the ultimate guide to using this thing. If you're not an expert, you're going to feel like a fraud pretty quick. Just say, look, I'm learning X. Here's all these cool things I learned about it. Maybe you'll find this useful too. That gets you a much better audience and gets you a lot more respect.
There is also a very strange but logical thing. If I would now start writing about, teaching someone Ruby, and I learned Ruby, let's say 12, 13 years ago, I forgot about what was the thing that was confusing me or what was very interesting that I discovered and so on. So I would just ran over that. But if there is a guy or a girl learning it now, they're much closer to it. They're emotionally very involved and at the correct stage. While you and I, we are just, two old guys now that are preaching something.
I'm amazed actually when sometimes people share the most elementary of tips on Twitter and, they blow up and they get tons of likes and retweets. And it's like, you think that is actually a really, really obvious thing, but it's not, clearly obvious to everyone because that's why it's got this engagement. So yeah, always try and think from the beginner's perspective where you can, because there's a lot of beginners out there. And at the end of the day, we're all beginners in something or other. There's always blind spots to what we know.
Yeah. And that's a nice way to end it. Thank you so much for being the guest here. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, it's been fantastic. If anyone wants to follow me, just come Peter C. It's Peterc on Twitter, because that's probably the best place to go, unless you type in JavaScript Weekly or Ruby Weekly or whatever.
Yeah, and from there you can discover all the weeklies that are around there.
Yeah, I don't promote them enough, but they get mentioned every now and then.
Thanks again. Have a great day.
Thank you.